house divided against itself cannot stand. These words have echoed throughout American history since the day they were spoken. They are a constant reminder of how dangerous division can truly be. One may argue that they've even changed the course of modern democracy. Where would we be today without the brutality of the Civil War, the triumph of abolition, or the political genius of Abraham Lincoln? The Lincoln-Douglas debates helped the North and South conclude that America could not simultaneously be a free nation while possessing enslaved people. The debates opened up the minds of the American public, making both the Civil War and abolition possible.
Slavery was a way of life before the Civil War. Although northern states abolished it in 1804, slavery continued to grow exponentially in the South. According to the 1790 census, Virginia alone had a slave population of 292,627. The number accounted for nearly 40% of the state population. Nationwide, the number of enslaved people exceeded 4 million.
The slave trade, beginning in the 16th century and ending in the 19th century, brought over about 12.5 million Africans to the New World.
The Middle Passage was the voyage that slave ships took from West Africa to North America. The journey lasted roughly 80 days, with small schooners to massive ships used to transport slaves. Africans were packed together below the decks with mere inches between their bodies and the ceilings. With little ventilation or clean drinking water, 2/5 of the slaves being transported died on the voyage.
Slavery is a theft of life, theft of work, theft of any property or produce. Kevin Bales.
The issue of slavery was supposed to be resolved in 1820 by the Missouri Compromise. The compromise decided that Missouri would be admitted into the Union as a slave state, while Maine would be admitted as a free state. All states within the Louisiana Purchase would also be free territories. This was to keep political power between slave and free states balanced by the 3/5 rule. However, new territories joining the Union exploited flaws in the government's solutions, such as if the Missouri Compromise was a violation of the Fifth Amendment, the right to own property. The Dred Scott decision was implemented as a compromise between abolitionists and anti-abolitionists.
Dred Scott was an enslaved man belonging to John Stanford. Stanford was a traveling army physician who was often accompanied by Scott while traveling. For a long period, Stanford was working in the free states of Wisconsin and Illinois. By current laws, Scott was considered a free man as he was also living in the state. Scott sued Stanford for his freedom in 1846. Surprisingly, the case made it to the U.S. Supreme Court, leading to the Dred Scott decision.
The Dred Scott decision decided that all African Americans were not and will never be considered American citizens, even in the northern states. This declared the Missouri Compromise as unconstitutional. To this day, it is considered one of the worst decisions made by the American Supreme Court in history.
With the country dividing further over these issues, upstart politician Abraham Lincoln watched from a distance. Lincoln was a well-mannered yet relatively unknown politician at the time. Having been a lawyer, his equity and leadership was well recognized in the law community. His radical opinions, however, earned him his fair share of enemies. Democrat Stephen Douglas was one of Lincoln's biggest rivals.
Compared to Lincoln, Stephen Douglas was a far more qualified politician. He had studied law in New York, been elected to the House of Representatives, and played a large part in the Compromise of 1850. Douglas was viewed as one of the most prominent politicians in the West, if not the country. Much of his political ideals were modeled off President Andrew Jackson. Jackson was known for his emphasis on government power and aggressive expansion of the U.S., principles which Douglas also supported. He also shared Jackson's short temper and stubbornness, earning him the nickname Little Giant.
In 1854, the nation divided once again with the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was described as Douglas's pet project, as he fought tirelessly to get it proposed and passed by Congress. The bill suggested popular sovereignty in the newly inducted states of Kansas and Nebraska. This meant that the people of the state decided whether or not slavery was to be allowed, rather than the government. What Douglas had not anticipated was the violence that would be caused by the bill, also known as Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas was a series of riots and murders between pro-slavery and anti-slavery supporters, fighting over if slavery should be allowed within Kansas. Nearly 200 people were thought to have been killed, but the confirmed number was only 54.
Bleeding Kansas was another example of why there was no compromise to slavery. Lincoln stated, "Let there be no compromise on the question of extending slavery. If there be, all our labor is lost and ere long must be done again.
Shortly after saying this, Lincoln received the Republican nomination to run for Senator of Illinois. During his House Divided Acceptance speech, he criticized Stephen Douglas once again for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This government could not endure permanently half-slave and half-free. Clearly, Douglas is not now with us. He does not pretend to be, he does not promise to ever be.
Douglas retaliated days later, calling Abraham Lincoln a radical who threatened the sturdiness of the Union. Lincoln thereupon challenged Douglas to a series of 7 debates throughout Illinois. With his risk-taking mindset, Douglas could not refuse. The date was set. The two would begin debating on August 21st and finish on October 15th. The man elected senator would be the victor.
The men arrived in Ottawa, Illinois, during one of the hottest days of the year. Despite the heat, more than 10,000 spectators were present. The debates were to be held in a 60-90-30 style, which would be later called Lincoln-Douglas format. Douglas was to speak for an hour, Lincoln would speak for an hour and a half, then Douglas would get a half-hour rebuttal. Douglas spoke first, explaining to the crowd the purpose of the debates and the issues they would be discussing. He began to speak on Lincoln's reactions to popular sovereignty, aggressively calling him a radical abolitionist who was trying to make Illinois a free Negro colony. Because of Douglas's attacks, Lincoln was put mostly on the defensive for the first debate. He defended that dehumanizing any human, including slaves, violates the Constitution. Douglas was taking away the right of striving to be a man.
He continued with citing the words of Henry Clay, Douglas's co-writer for the Compromise of 1850. Clay admitted that slavery was this great evil, the darkest spot in the map of our country. In Douglas's rebuttal, he pointed out that the Constitution was written by white men, therefore applying to only whites. Although Lincoln would not be able to respond this debate, he would later highlight how the Constitution was for all men. Many of the debates were similar to this. Douglas would consistently attack the Missouri Compromise, pleading for the Fifth Amendment. He would often warn of the dangers of emancipation, saying they would destroy the stability of the Union. In the second debate, Douglas created the Freeport Doctrine, a belief that the opinions of the public outweighed the Supreme Court. Lincoln would criticize the Dred Scott decision and argued that slavery's only solution was emancipation. Both had differing opinions, yet helped America accept the idea that a war must be fought.
In the end, Douglas appeared victorious when he was elected Senator of Illinois, but in the long run, the debates only seemed to stifle his career. Prior to the debates, Douglas was thought to have been the most fitting Democratic candidate for the election of 1860. The debates, however, caused him to clash with many of his fellow Democrats. This caused the already divided Democratic Party to crumble further. With the Democrats in shambles, Lincoln was propelled into the national spotlight. The debates had significantly increased his popularity, causing him to be nominated for president in the election of 1860.
Douglas, too, was nominated, but this time much less favorable in the public eye. Lincoln, with his charm and charisma, easily beat the little giant 180 electoral votes to 12. Although this isn't taking into account the popular vote, it was still a massive victory for Abraham and the Republicans. From there, the rest is history, like when Lincoln created the team of rivals and when the South seceded in 1861. Next came the Battle of Gettysburg, the burning of Atlanta, and finally, the Union victory in 1865.
Notice how despite all of the prior debating, diplomacy was not reached until 1865. Why did 600,000 people have to die to find a consensus? Some blame Lincoln, calling him war hungry and a stubborn negotiator. But let us not forget the situation he was in. The South would only be willing to negotiate when defeated in combat, making a war seem necessary. But President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, had a different take on the pre-war days. All we ask is to be left alone. I worked night and day for 12 years to prevent the war, but I could not. The North was mad and blind, would not let us govern ourselves, and so the war came.
Regardless, the war happened largely because of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They helped Lincoln gain the political influence to run for president while also pointing out the flaws of slavery.